Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Romans. Keep in mind, I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. We're going to pick it up in chapter 4, and verse 1 says, "What then can we say that Abraham, our physical ancestor, has found?" Now he's asking this question coming from chapter 3. And if you remember, that was a foundational chapter where Paul lays out in legal form the salvation that God provided for us. And that's extremely important. Now, if you want to go back and look at some of those videos, I believe you can go on Facebook and find them. But they're also on my YouTube channel, BP The Bible Perspective. But anyway, because we defined the terms, and it's important to understand those terms that I'll be referring to as we move forward. But when we came to the end of the chapter, Paul said, well, where is boasting? Well, what kind of law makes you boast? He says there is none, right? It's the law of faith. So as he brings up the subject of Abraham, the great conflict that is in the religious world and even in Christianity, the great conflict is works versus grace. Now, as he brings up Abraham, this was a pretty big deal in the first century church. It's not so much for us today. We don't wrestle with that. By AD 70, the Jewish church had been swallowed up into the Gentile church, and then it's been that way ever since. But the impact of the law of Moses is important because what the law says, the law Moses said was, here's how you ought to be right before God. You have to do all of these works in order to be right before God. And so the impact of the law of Moses has influenced every religion, including Christianity, that as plain and simple as chapter 3 was, most of Christianity teach. Now let me say that again. Most of Christianity teach some form of works, salvation by works. So when we ask different questions like, once saved, always saved. Can you lose your salvation? All of this, those questions, are those who believe those things, believe them because they believe man, has to do something in order to be saved. And so Paul is going to tackle that and deal with this in this chapter. And actually, as we move forward, he's going to constantly revisit this issue in his letters. That's why I said it's the great conflict, even in Christianity. Works versus grace. So anytime you have to do something yourself. I have to do something to be saved. I have to work, earn, live a certain way to be saved, to stay saved. That's a salvation by works. And Paul is going to deal with that. Now, so he asks the question. Now, verse 2, he says, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to brag about, but not before God. Now, just think about that. Remember, the word justify is the act of making one right. In the context, it is God's act, or the act of, or the process, or the method of being made right before God. And right off he says, if Abraham was made right by works, he would have something to brag about. But he says, but not before God. And that's what religion does. Religion brags about their works. I don't do this. I don't do that. Remember, there was a parable that Jesus told about a Pharisee. He said that the Pharisee and the publican were those who went up. They were the sinners of the day. They were the lewd people. He said both of them went up to the temple and to pray. And the Pharisee prayed, Lord, I thank you that I don't drink, I don't smoke, I keep the law, I tithe, I do all these things, and I'm not like this publican. Then he said, well, the publican didn't even lift his head up, but just simply said, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said that publican went away justified rather than the Pharisee. Why? You don't have anything to boast, because what the Pharisee probably didn't say was all of the bad things that God disapproved of. And remember, when it comes to God, anything less than perfect, you fall short. You are disqualified. You are rejected. That's why you can never be made right by doing works. Now, verse 3 says, for what does the scripture say? Because that presents a very, again, trying to live right, you always live in a state of condemnation because you know I'm missing it. Because you have to understand God is perfect. Even that little attitude that you have, right? That meanness, that honoriness, whatever, you fail at God's righteousness. So he says, for the scripture says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. Now this statement is, we see throughout the New Testament, it is extremely important because what it tells you is that faith has always been God's method. And it was always God's way. It was never about works. Verse 4, now to the one who works, pay is not considered as a gift, but as something owed. Now think about that. If I work for something, I legitimately work for something, then yeah, I can say you owe this to me. If I could keep the commandments of God, I can brag, God, you owe me salvation. If I could keep all his commandments that he says that are requirements to be right with him, then God owes me. It's not grace. If you tell me that I have to be baptized in order to be saved, then as soon as I come out of the water, I can say, God, you owe me salvation. If you tell me that I have to stop drinking, smoking, dress a certain way, and don't go to these places, then when I do those things, I can say, God, you owe me. But he says, but not before God. He says, the one who works, then notice he says, pay is not considered as a gift, but it's something owed. Notice the word gift, because remember that word gift is also in the same family of word of grace. And remember, salvation comes through grace. But to the one, verse 5, but to the one who does not work, but believes on him who declares the ungodly to be righteous, his faith is credited to him for righteousness. Now remember all of the work that salvation did. All of the work that Jesus did on the cross. That's how God cleared the ungodly. So how do we receive it? Remember he said it's by faith. It is to all those who believe. Notice it is not to all those who are baptized. It's not to all those who live a certain way. Now, verse 6 says, likewise David also speaks of the blessing of the man God credits righteousness. Notice this, apart from works. How joyful are those whose lawless acts are forgiven and whose sins are covered. By the way, these lawless acts, we always think about if I steal, if I drink, if I curse, if I fornicate, commit adultery. The lawless acts include being bitter, lying, being dishonest. There was a thing in the law that says if you see your neighbor's ox going astray, and he says, go and get the ox and keep it until your neighbor comes. Watch this. If you don't do that, that's breaking God's law. See, that very little thing. See, those little things we excuse, but to God, he doesn't excuse. You fail at the law. He says, how joyful are those whose lawless acts are forgiven and whose sins are covered. How joyful is the man the Lord would never charge with sin. And the only way you could not be charged with sin is by faith in Jesus Christ. Pick it up in verse 9 in the next video. I will see you then.